All right, we're all set. Thank you, Tricia.
Okay, thank you. Just to let people know that I'm comfortable, there aren't a lot of slides, and so I'm comfortable with people asking questions at any point. Either put them in the chat or raise your hand like Sandy said. And I believe Sandy will do them because I'll be more focused on what I'm saying. My name's Tricia Gerrodette. I live in Sierra Vista, which is in Cochise County, and is indeed a component issue on the San Pedro River, which is a unique river that flows north. It starts in Mexico and flows north into the United States. So this area was traditional land for the Chiricahua Apache and the Subflow Indians. And with that, let's see if I can start a slideshow. I need Sandy's help here to. Okay, now I think if I run it somewhere, where do I find that?
Click on slideshow. There you go.
There we go. No, don't go away. Oh, it's trying to be helpful. Oh my gosh, I don't want that. Run this thing. Run, play. Yay. All right. So I don't know your level of knowledge out there in Zoom world of groundwater and surface water issues in Arizona. They can be pretty complex. I'll try to synthesize and make it as simple as possible. So I see my little bar at the very top of the screen, but hopefully you don't, and you can read the whole thing.
We can see the whole thing, Tricia.
Great, thank you. So in Arizona, we have groundwater and we have surface water. And the state has spent a great number of years pretending that the two never meet. They are working actually on having the two be connected in some complex fashion. And I'll have a couple of slides where I talk about that a little later. So if you live, for example, in the Phoenix area, you might be familiar with the issue of assured water supply. You will know that if you live inside an AMA, an active management area. And the concept behind both the assured and the adequate was, at least in theory, to protect the consumer. So that if you bought a home inside this AMA, the developer had been told by the state that there was no problem, 100-year water supply for that housing development. Much less stringent rules apply outside these AMAs, called an adequate water supply, but it was still pretty much the same idea in my mind anyway. And it was about assuring people that there would be water in the future. And it just had a couple of different wrinkles, one of them specifying that as long as there was water from 1,200 feet below the surface up to the surface, you had an adequate water supply. And you can read more about how all those rules work. ADWR lays them out fairly simply, I think, on that website with that link. So go there if you want to read up on how they present it and the factors they use in deciding whether or not a development should qualify for an assured water supply designation. So where does our water come from? Colorado River, again, most of you in the Phoenix area, I'm sure, pretty aware of the importance of the Colorado River water coming through the CAP canal. We do use some surface water, other surface water, almost 1/5. Groundwater, 40%. And where I live, it's effectively 100% of the water we use that I turn on the tap in my house comes from groundwater. And that is true for many of the rural areas around the state, 100% reliant on groundwater. Effluent, we're becoming more aware of the importance of effluent and treating it and reusing it or recharging it back into the ground. So how much water do we use in our society? Well, the average depicted for around the world is 22 gallons per person per day. The US is a whole lot, uses a whole lot more per person. And Phoenix takes really poor numbers here with 184. So what is that? More than 8 times what a person would need living a poor lifestyle in India or Bangladesh or wherever. So Phoenix doesn't do too well. And an awful lot of it probably goes for green grass, some of which is useful and some of which is very definitely just ornamental. So here's a little cartoon graphic about how we used to draw water out of the ground. You probably have seen images about people lowering a bucket into a well and bringing it back up to the surface, and that was how you got your water. And those wells were dug by hand. They were 10s and 20 feet deep. I mean, they were really pretty shallow, but the water was there. And that worked for quite some time, as long as the water table, which is where this little squiggly line is, you can see that. And you made sure you were a little bit below that, and you could drop a bucket and haul up your water. By 1945, you can see that the water table, the squiggly line, has dropped. And now we have to dig a hole and put liner, put something into the earth, and then drop the pump down below that. And now by 1995, we need an update on this. You can see we have to drill a bigger well and put this casing deeper, and then the pump itself deeper, because now the groundwater level is way down here. We're having to pump it up through all those rocks that are storing water. Here's a little more sort of detail about it. And one of the big things I want people to take away about groundwater is, I know that I certainly did for years, and I suspect other people do too. We tend to think of it as this underground lake that, you know, is just like water, but it's liquid. It's water in between rocks, rock particles, mud. You know, I mean, the rock particles can be very small. It can be sandy, or it can be gravelly, or it can be very fine, compact, like a clay. but that is where the water is stored. It is not this sort of lake. And it's also certainly an uneven surface, but again, for purposes of drawing a graphic, you can see that they've just kind of drawn a straight line. So until you reach the water table, you're in what is called the unsaturated zone, which means it's dry. Try digging down a few inches in our soil. It's usually dry. And at some point, if you dig deep enough, and depending on where your water table level is, you will hit the saturated zone and groundwater. And that is where my company gets water from. The company that delivers water to me gets water from. And sometimes over on the right-hand side, you can see that there is the graphic representation of a river, a lake, water that shows itself on the surface of the land. And that's straight water for us. So I got a few more graphics. So again, this is similar to the one we saw before. And you can see the water table level, this dotted line, and up above the unsaturated zone, dry. And now we've inserted a well, like we saw a couple slides ago. It needs to go in deep. It needs to run on a pump. You can't just manually pump it anymore. And this is how anybody who sinks a private well or a company who sinks a great big well, this is what they are doing when they sink a well. They go down into the water table, usually quite a few feet beyond where they first hit water, and then they start pumping up. And any well that pumps water develops what is called a cone of depression, which means that nearby water in the rock particles gets drawn towards that pumping well. And the idea in your mind that I've found works for most people is to think of a thick milkshake. And if you put your straw in the middle of it and suck on it fairly robustly, you create a cone of depression. And then if you quit sucking on it, it flattens out, but everything has dropped. You've taken some milkshake out, and now the level is lower. And if you start sucking on it again, you create another cone of depression. And if you keep doing it, the cone of depression gets bigger and lower. But again, if you stop, it will flatten out, but it will all be reduced. So that's wells and cones of depression. Let's see what happened. Try that. Okay. We can't see groundwater. So what we see is groundwater reaching the surface, and then it gets classified as surface water. And it has different sets of rules governing surface water as groundwater in Arizona. So the top shows basically a river. If you have been lucky enough to see a river in Arizona, you see the groundwater being at a high enough level, or the river having cut down enough, that you see water on the surface. So it can be a river, it can be a lake, it could be a teeny tiny pond. But if there's water showing at the surface, it came from recent rainfall or from the groundwater. And so if it's in the top section, it's the first bullet that we call gaining. We call it perennial, which means that there's always water showing in that river, even if it hasn't rained for months and months, there's still water. And that's because the depth of, or the level of the groundwater is above the depth of the land where the river is showing up. So we pump and we lower the level of the groundwater, and sometimes we can show wet stretches, and many times we don't. And so the second graphic shows what we call a losing reach or an intermittent reach, meaning there can be dry stretches and then there can be wet stretches because of different soils or whatever. So it's a little bit of both depending on where we are, type of thing. The bottom one is a losing area again, but this time it's always dry. It doesn't fluctuate, and it only has water in it after a rain. So that's called ephemeral in Arizona law, water law terms. So we have perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral for designations of what you could see in a riverbed. And then there are sample plants that you would encounter in some of these areas. And sadly, by the time you get to a dry or losing, pretty much the only thing left is tamarisk and other stuff. But you have lost your cottonwood and willows. So, any questions yet? Okay. Similar sort of graphic, but sort of focused a little bit more on the groundwater that we don't see. And so we do it in cross section. So we have that dry again at the top. And then here's the water table with the dashed line. So the first water encountered is an aquifer. And in this case, it's called an unconfined aquifer. And then the next couple of layers can actually be arranged in any kind of sequence. And actually, the first lining, I think, can be a confining bed. And then you would get into confined aquifer. So you may not have much in terms of an unconfined aquifer. And so the confining bed is usually pretty impermeable soil, like I referred to before. So clay is, I think, the commonest. And there can be mixes of layers, and these very seldom run in straight lines. They're angled and they pinch down, it's called, so thin or thick. And but this is the simplified way to think of it. And so the first layer of the ability to find water and pump it out of the ground is not very old water. You can see it says days and years, and the scientists measured that by isotopes. Then a deeper confined aquifer could have taken centuries to accumulate, and even deeper, slower moving, takes millennia. Some of the water measured in the San Pedro River Valley is 2,000 years old. So I think you can probably gather that pumping out this stuff took centuries or millennia to accumulate. If you pump it out in dozens of years, It's not going to get replaced all that quickly. So you can create problems. Okay, here's a here's a screenshot of one case in what is referred to as the Gila River Adjudication, sometimes just called the Adjudication. It's been going on for, what is it, 45, 46 years. And it has to get through several big hurdles. And so ADWR has been working on the entire Gila River adjudication since it started. And the San Pedro is the first component of the adjudication that they have pursued in the most detail.
Tricia?
Yeah.
We're not seeing the screenshot.
Whoa. Right.
There we go.
Oh, okay.
Technical report.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks.
So because it's the first one that ADWR is pursuing in detail, everybody who has any interest in the adjudication, but no interest here particularly, is still following it in detail, because whatever is decided here will be used in the Verde Valley, for example, when they do that one. So everybody and his cousin who's engaged in water law is following the San Pedro issues and the science. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, hopefully, that this started in February 2003, almost 19 years ago. And this is, again, a very small component, and it's called the Subflow Technical Report. And you can, all of those are hot linked. You can read on them. You would search for superiorcourt.maricopa.gov and then look for the general stream adjudication. And then you will find many dozens, many scores of contested cases, each with their own number and their own title. And so you can find out where things stand. But this is the most active part of the Gila River adjudication at the moment. So actually, the most recent entry here, the August 30th, 2021, was a big decision by the court. I guess I haven't heard, and there's certainly nothing on this that indicates anyone has challenged it yet. But the judge made a decision, and it's called an order. Looks like I may have gone a bit off screen there. That you don't need to see at the top part of it. It's just identifying the general adjudication and the case number. And here is the order determining the vertical boundary of the subflow zone. And we get really wonky here. We got lots of hydrologists and lots of attorneys working on this. So again, everyone is so concerned about this because how the court determines the subflow zone here will also be used in any other river like the Verde. So paying attention here. So we can see down at the bottom, the summary. For purposes of developing groundwater model to test whether the cone of depression developed by a well, remember we looked at that, located outside the lateral boundaries of the subflow zone, and we have to fight over the subflow zone for every river, of course, has intersected whether the cone of depression has intersected the subflow zone. In that case, it's pumping subflow. And the court has already decreed that subflow is surface water. So, yeah, it's clear as mud, probably, but this was really a very important point in the adjudication. It's a big decision. And it's why I say that the state is actually moving towards connecting surface water and groundwater. We've spent many decades saying that they do, of course, treat them very differently. But there's been some acknowledgement, thanks to all the scientists, that you can be taking water that is groundwater because it's under the ground, but it actually was going to be part of this river, and therefore it was going to be surface water. And so now we're going to call it subflow because we have to have a name. And now if you're pumping that, you're pumping water that would be the same as surface water, which has different rights, different laws that apply to it compared to groundwater. That was pretty dense. Anybody got questions?
Yeah, just to make sure I understand. So subflow is this term for groundwater that would become surface water. Mm-hmm. And so if anyone's pumping that water then should be subject to whatever regulations apply to surface water. Yes. I'm wondering, are those regulations generally more stringent or less stringent, or does it vary very widely?
Well, it varies depending on the AMA or the non-AMA, but the big importance of surface water in general is that people, white people in particular, said there was water flowing in this stream and I was the first white person here to make use of it. And so I have the first claim on it. Well, that actually
Yep.
come around to bite white people in the butt, because then it turns out, oh, some of the native people were here first. And so they have an even older right to it than you do. So that's been an interesting wrinkle. So the determination of rights and the age of the right tends to be related to surface water. So yes, it is very important. And so naturally, everybody who thinks they have a surface water right, you can dry up a river without siphoning the water out of the surface flow. You can be pumping the subflow. So yeah, this is a really big step in my mind for Arizona.
Thanks.
Sure. Anyone else? All right, didn't want to go that way. Try that. Whoa, how about that? That was the last one. Perfect.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat right now. I just was pointing out that in the chat that groundwater, so for surface water, you have this, first in time, first in right, like the first, that's the highest priority. But for groundwater, there is only a use right that is associated with the property. So there's no property right in groundwater.
Although certain farmers and ranchers very firmly express that it's their water, it goes with their land, etc. But yeah, that is not the legal definition. It's just whether or not you use it. And so that takes us into the realm of, I think many people, even in Tucson and Phoenix, are aware of the huge issues over in the Wilcox area, the Sulphur Springs Valley, big agricultural interests sinking huge wells and drawing up a lot of water, and then drying up residential wells that are only a couple of 100 feet deep. And it's all perfectly legal.
And that kind of gets us to some of the things we might see at the legislature this session on groundwater. One big concern is that inside the active management areas, you have some regulation of groundwater. Outside, you basically don't have any. And so there is going to be a bill again to try and establish some type of regulatory mechanism for limiting groundwater pumping outside the active management areas. One of those is the rural management area bill. And we haven't seen the language on that for this year yet, but we definitely think that the past language needs to be strengthened to really, you really have to have some teeth in it to limit groundwater pumping. So that's one. And then another is allowing for easier establishment of irrigation non-expansion areas. And those are kind of a step down from an active management area. And they basically say you can't increase agriculture in within those areas. And so they're looking to allow for those to be established based on what we're projecting to see as far as pumping versus what's happening right now. So that would be an improvement as well. And then there will be bills on trying to get better metering and assessments of what's going on with groundwater. And also,
yeah, there are even more basic bills that just say, we want to measure how much you're pumping. We don't know that.
And then there are bills to make it worse, like to allow for deeper drilling for groundwater in places like the Harquahela, and also to allow private entities to import that water into active management areas. And so those are just a few of the things that we'll be looking at. But I mean, I guess one positive is that there are a lot more people who understand that there is a groundwater pumping issue. For years, we've been saying, oh, Arizona, we're so great. We have this Groundwater Management Act. And now we're finally at a point where we're like, okay, let's do something about this, especially outside the AMAs.
Well, but the non-AMA, so the rest of Arizona, groundwater committee for the governor's bigger group met yesterday. And Gail Griffin, who is a co-chair, was adamant about some things and definitely said we should be looking at bringing in water from elsewhere, like the Mississippi.
Yes, we still have that.
Yes, we.
The other thing, I don't think I mentioned this the other day, Tricia, but Department of Water Resources is going to have a bill to, and this relates to the active management areas themselves, like to push out that 5th management plan, push out the date.
Oh, yeah.
And so just to be clear about that they're supposed to achieve this this fictional safe yield, the idea that you would not be taking out more water than is being recharged. And they're going to push the date out on achieving that and having a plan to achieve it. So I think one of the things that we need to do is also, if they're going to push the date out, then they should include some more stringent requirements. So it actually, like, if it's not happening now and you just continue the same thing for a longer period of time, you know, it's not going to happen. So that's one other thing.
I think a core that I have decided that got us on that path and keeps us on that path and is there's a reference to renewable water. And that was what the Colorado River and the CAP canal was renewable water. And so that was the authorization to build the canal, bring the water in, and the Colorado River, of course, was forever going to supply that amount of water. And of course, most people know by now that that's no longer something we can count on, but that I haven't seen any proposal to change that. And I don't find that people talk about it either. I asked once at a webinar, so does ADWR still deem the Colorado River as renewable water supply? And they wouldn't answer. So.
Any other questions? I just want to encourage folks to go ahead and ask questions. And if this seems confusing, it is. It's not like, oh, this, you know, it is. Our water laws are complicated. I feel like they've been made purposely confusing. And so, you know, it makes it difficult for people to see what's going on. So yeah, don't hesitate.
Has another question. Yes.
Or just also to make sure I understand, so the person you mentioned who was suggesting, let's get some Mississippi River water, I'm assuming that's instead of cutting back here, let's just get more water from somewhere else.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, well, another question, just other than the state legislature, what other decision-making bodies have any control over this? Are there any is there local control, county control of any of this, or it's all decided by this at the state level?
Well, I would start, I guess, by saying that there are a lot of this is from the state, but then we have what are called federal reserved water rights. And so that's, for example, the federal government claims the right to some water in the national forests and in the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area and wilderness areas. So the federal reserve water rights are also being fought at the state court level. That's what one of the graphics I put up was that case. And as I understand it, it's because in the either 50s or 60s, the McConnell Act, I think it was. No, that's not right. Anyway, an act in Congress where apparently the Western states promised the federal government that the Western states would do a good job of protecting the federal water rights in the state adjudication process. So we've been in the state adjudication process ever since. So other than that, I would say, I don't think anybody except the legislature sets these laws and controls the water. Sandy?
Well, the Department of Water Resources, but through legislation, established by the Arizona legislature. And then I guess, cities can become, like, inside the AMAs, a designated water provider, like, right. So they have the assured water supply.
They're still complying with
Right, with state law.
rules. Yeah, state law.
Yeah.
I
So,
don't think there's anyone else.
yeah. With some, like, with surface water, you get more of the federal provisions. With groundwater, not as much. I mean, there are provisions for delivering groundwater as drinking water, right? So you have the Safe Drinking Water Act, but that regulates what comes out of the tap. So,
Right, and that's ADEQ and
Yeah.
right. So,
Yeah.
So
there's a question: is there a clear explanation of groundwater banking and the whole trading of credits?
that's much less my thing. So either Sandy or Jennifer, I think, could do it. Groundwater banking is just kind of what it sounds like, but I don't know about the trading of credits.
I know that maybe I will bump this to Jennifer to talk, because I was going to talk a little bit about the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District and how that works.
Okay. But she's covering that at the next, at one of the future sessions, isn't she?
I don't know.
Okay.
Jennifer?
Are you available, Jennifer? You're still muted, so maybe not.
All right, well, I can just quickly say that, so there's this entity called the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, and it's established in statute. Basically, the developers wanted it, and they wanted it so they could pump groundwater in areas and join the CAGRD, and then the recharge of the water would happen far from where it's being pumped, right? But they would still have 100-year assured water supply. And so, like, that's one of the real problems with the CAGRD, is that you can be pumping here, developing here, causing localized issues, and water is being recharged far from where it's being pumped. The other problem with it is it was set up to, basically utilize this excess CAP water, but there isn't excess CAP water. And so it is.
Yukon was fairly smart. They did have some excess CAP water, and they did recharge their aquifer. And so they're in pretty good shape to then draw it back down, unfortunately, but they did bank it. Whereas I think in the Phoenix area, it was just a paper credit more than it was a wet water credit. And they quit issuing, ADWR quit issuing that adequacy for Perennial. That was a pretty dramatic step on their part, I thought.
The other thing I would mention about the, and this is just generally regarding groundwater, is in the law right now, it says if you're pumping groundwater, you can't accumulate these credits, right? Because why would you be able to accumulate credits while you're pumping? But unless you're a mine, and the mine's got special exception written into the statutes, starting with specifically for the Resolution Copper mine, the mine that proposes to destroy Oak Flat. And so after they got it, then Freeport McMoran wanted it too, so they came back in and got it. And there is talk about expanding that, so any entity could do what the mines do, pump and still accumulate these credits, which doesn't really add up. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Deborah. I can look for like see if there's a fact sheet that would do better than I did.
Yeah, I have another sort of extended question, is that I'm not completely clear on that whole process of recharge and effluent being is not considered groundwater, even if it's going, it's being put into the rivers. And so in some areas like the San Pedro and places like that, the whole exchange that you're not pumping groundwater. I think the law is just so confusing, and the number of acronyms is just so overwhelming that when you're looking at it, it's very hard to get sort of a clear picture of, so what is really right and what is really not so right. Is that clear? And so when they're talking about that, the banking that some like cities like Tucson can put effluent recharge, but that's not considered groundwater. What does that mean? I wasn't really clear on what that meant.
I think it is groundwater. Once it's gotten out of the treatment process and is discharged into the ground.
And did they get credit for that?
Well, they keep track of the quantities so that they have credits in this X amount, but I believe it's then groundwater. I don't know. Sandy, do they actually, I mean, it qualifies under certain sections of law, certainly as groundwater, but it's being tracked probably as, effluent credit that they can then pump back out at some point in the future. And then maybe that's where it's not groundwater, but it's your recharge credit. So
okay,
not going to hurt the aquifer, right?
Right.
Yeah, they do make distinctions for like banking. Like if you're taking CAP water and you're banking it, that is distinct from groundwater. And
right.
In fact,
no, it's in the ground, right?
Right. Agreed. But like Salt River Project, for example, is proposing this huge gas plant expansion in Coolidge, and it has all kinds of issues with it, including serious environmental injustice. But it is, but if you read their application, they say, well, currently the plant is pumping groundwater, but when they expand, they're going to go ahead and use banked CAP water, those credits they have for banked CAP water, but they're still going to be pumping the same groundwater, right? So
it's paper shuffling and accounting.
It makes it sound better. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. A lot of I don't know, smoke and mirrors, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. We're almost at the top of the hour. Hope you learned something.
Can I ask one simple question?
Ooh.
Okay. I keep getting assured from the city of Phoenix that we have 100-year supply of water. Does that sound realistic? It doesn't sound realistic to me, to be honest about it. And I can't see how they can say that if you don't have water coming in and it's being used. How can they say that? So
You went right to the heart of the issue. Yeah, it's a simple question. probably a whole bunch of answers. I think they're more than kidding themselves and the public, but yeah, I don't think it's particularly true. And that is really what a lot of the fights are about, is why can you keep saying that when you're getting less from the Colorado, and then there's just so much there in the ground, and yeah.
I mean, it's so ridiculous that in the conversations, they actually refer to wet water, right? Like, so that's like, that's water versus the paper water. So I you know, I think that, I don't think the city of Phoenix had, or any entity has anything to be smug about. The only active management area, well, I shouldn't say the only, but the only one that had a goal to achieve safe yield that is, you know, in theory, substantially there is Tucson, but they are, as the CAP cuts continue, they are projected to come out of safe yield. So yeah, I think that is, yeah, it's optimistic. I don't know about those wells. Do you? I wrote a note about it.
Yeah, no, just that it's an expansion of all that ag effort, is Riverview Dairy. Yeah, big, deep wells.
And there are no limits on it. And, you know, they can totally, you know, pump neighbors' wells dry, which is what has been happening, not, you know, not just in that area, but it's been a huge problem out in La Paz County and Mojave as well. You have people who've lived there a long time, and then these like super pumpers come in, you know, in a lot of cases to grow alfalfa and deplete nearby wells.
And you're stuck with, your property now is basically worthless unless someone has the money to drill a deeper well. How do you sell something that has no water?
And that's risky because it could be, you know, it's not deep enough, right? You know, and then before you know it, you're
after 10 years or 20 years, it's not deep enough again. Yes,
hauling water.
It's literally a race to the bottom.
Yeah, we have a couple of other links to some presentations from last year that Jennifer Martin helped set up, on, including one on subsidence and earth fissures that I think is pretty helpful, and then one on agricultural pumping outside the AMAs. So we can provide those links as well. Thank you so much, Tricia. Great job as always. Appreciate you sharing all your knowledge, and thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, we'll send out those links. And if you have follow-up questions, you know, feel free, you can send them to me and I'll get them to Tricia if you don't have her contact info. So have a great afternoon and weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sandy.